It was October 2017 when I took the trip. I was 37 at the time and living in a small rented house just outside of Dundee, Oregon. My work as a mechanic had slowed down with the colder weather coming in, and I had built up some decent vacation time. The idea of getting off the grid for a while had been pressing on my mind for weeks. I didn't want to waste the last crisp, dry days of fall before the wet season came and turned the woods into mud. I'd been hunting since I was a teenager. My father had taken me into the mountains of southern Idaho every fall, and those trips stuck with me. The calm, the cold, the trees, the silence you only get when you're miles away from the closest road. I missed it. I missed sitting still, watching, breathing in cold air, feeling like the woods were swallowing me up. So I picked a spot I'd been to a couple of times, a place called Weyerhaeuser Timberland, about 100 miles south of where I lived. It wasn't a touristy area, not many campers. You had to know your way around to get in deep. I packed light, just a small two-man tent, my Remington 700 bolt action, my sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, water, and my stove. I carried a few tools, a hatchet, a foldable saw, a fixed-blade knife. Enough gear to stay 3 nights, maybe 4. My plan was to hike in 10 miles, set up camp near one of the old clearings, and track black-tailed deer. I didn't even care if I tagged anything. I just wanted quiet. I parked my truck just off a Forest Service road, one that was technically closed, but the gate had been cut open years ago and never fixed. I'd been down that road in the past, back when I was scouting with a friend. I checked my gear, made sure I had my tags and compass and GPS, and started hiking in just before noon. The first day was peaceful. I didn't see another soul. I crossed 2 creeks, saw some fresh sign tracks, scat, a bit of torn up ground. Nothing recent, but it felt promising. Around 4 p.m., I found a small plateau about halfway up a long ridge, surrounded by evergreens. I set up camp there on dry ground. I had good visibility in 3 directions and enough cover from the wind. I ate, boiled water, and turned in early. That night was cold. Not freezing, but I had to cinch my sleeping bag tight around my face. I woke up twice, once from the sound of branches snapping somewhere in the woods. I wasn't scared, not really. I knew how the forest sounded at night. Things creaked. Animals moved. I stayed awake for a few minutes and then drifted off again. The next morning, I started tracking. I moved north, up the ridge, trying to keep the wind in my face. I went slowly. I wasn't just looking to shoot something, I wanted to move right. I found more sign around mid-morning. Older tracks, a rub on a young tree, no fresh droppings. I kept moving. By noon, I'd made it 2 miles from camp. That's when I found the boot print. It was in soft mud near a seep, not mine. I could see the heel, the edge of the tread, the full toe. It had rained 3 days earlier. That meant the print was at least that fresh. I stared at it for a while, trying to tell how recent it was. The edge was sharp. Too sharp, maybe. I didn't like that. It meant someone was nearby, possibly watching. Still, it wasn't illegal for someone else to be out there. It wasn't even that unusual, but it did bother me. I headed back to camp slowly. I kept checking my surroundings. I didn't see anyone. No movement. No scent of smoke. Just woods and cold wind and the sound of my boots. When I got back to camp, I noticed a change I hadn't expected. The small branch I had leaned against my tent zipper, something I always do as a habit, was on the ground. Could have fallen. That was my first thought, but it didn't look like it had fallen. It was laid neatly next to the base of the tent. I stood there for a long time, my rifle over my shoulder, trying to decide what to do. My gut told me something was wrong. I walked around the perimeter of my camp. No prints. Nothing obvious. I checked my gear. Nothing was taken, but something felt off, like someone had looked through it. I made dinner and stayed close to the fire that night. I didn't sleep right. I kept hearing small things, twigs cracking, maybe an animal, maybe not. I kept unzipping the tent and looking out. The woods always looked the same, just darkness and trees. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a very soft, deliberate sound. Something brushing against nylon. Not the wind, something touching the tent. I didn't move. I stayed still, heart pounding, holding my breath. I couldn't see anything. My rifle was next to me. I stayed like that, frozen, until I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent just an inch and look out. Nothing. No one. But in the dirt, just in front of the tent, was a boot print. Not fresh, just clear enough to know it hadn't been there when I went to bed. That's when I decided I wasn't staying the full 4 days. I packed quickly that morning. I didn't eat. I didn't boil water. I just got my things into my pack, broke down the tent, and started heading west, toward my truck. I stayed alert. I moved faster than I normally would. I wanted to be gone before noon, but around 10 a.m., I saw it again. Another print. This time it was to the side of the trail I was taking down. A faint but clear mark on a patch of dark loam. Someone had been following me, not walking with me, not passing me, just stepping in when I was stopped, moving when I was moving, staying just far enough away not to be seen. I changed course. Instead of heading straight to the road, I cut southwest, downhill, through dense growth. I wanted to come out below my truck and circle back from the side. I figured if someone was trying to flank me or track me, I'd spot them when I looped around. I never saw anyone, not directly, but at one point, about half an hour from the road, I stopped at the edge of a rocky outcrop to catch my breath. I looked downslope. That's when I saw the movement, just a shadow between trees. It was upright. It ducked out of sight the second I saw it. Not an animal, not a bear, a man. I didn't wait. I started moving faster, almost at a jog. I was sweating, my breath was heavy, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get to the truck. I pushed through brush, ignoring the noise, not caring how loud I was anymore. When I got to the road, I stayed hidden. I crouched behind a log, watching the path I'd just come from. I waited 10 minutes, 15. Then I stood and ran to my truck. The bed cover had been unzipped. That zipper had a loop I always tucked under the tailgate. It wasn't in place. The cover was halfway open. I opened the door, got inside fast, and locked it. I checked the back. Nothing missing, but someone had definitely looked through it. I started the engine and drove fast, bouncing down the rocky road, scraping against low branches. I didn't calm down until I hit the paved road 30 minutes later. Even then, I kept checking my rearview mirror. I told myself maybe it had just been another hunter. Maybe I'd spooked him as much as he'd spooked me. Maybe it was a fluke, but I knew it wasn't. I've hunted most of my life. I've met a lot of other hunters in the woods. This didn't feel like that. This felt like someone who didn't want me there. I got home that afternoon. I unpacked, washed everything, put my gear away. I didn't sleep that night either. I just kept replaying it all, the boot prints, the sounds, the figure between the trees. A week later, I went back online and checked a few forums I used to post on. I found a thread about that same timberland. One of the users had mentioned seeing someone out there a year earlier. Someone not in hunting gear, not with a weapon, just watching them from the trees and disappearing when they approached. Another guy chimed in about finding animal traps, not legal ones, homemade snares, and a few odd campsites, places where it looked like someone had been staying but not with tents, makeshift lean-tos, camo tarps, trash hidden under leaves. It gave me chills. I never went back to that area. I hunt closer to home now, and I never go alone. There's something in those woods. Not a ghost, not some myth, just a person or people who don't want to be found. And they don't want you there either. I think about that trip a lot. I think about how easily it could have gone worse. and I think about how someone was close enough to unzip my tent, leave a print, and then vanish into the dark without making a sound. It wasn't a story I ever wanted to have, but it's mine now, and it's real. I don't really talk about this much. It's been years now, but sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and still feel like I'm back in those woods. I still camp sometimes, but never alone anymore, and never in the Southwest. I was 26 when it happened, and I'd been solo camping for a couple years by then. I trusted myself, maybe too much. I always thought as long as I respected the wild and paid attention, I'd be fine. I wasn't some dumb tourist with a Bluetooth speaker and a folding chair. I grew up outside Missoula. I knew what I was doing. Back in 2017, I took time off from my job in Denver. I worked in construction, mostly renovation work, and I had about 2 weeks free before my next job started. I'd been wanting to explore New Mexico, and I had this idea that I'd go up north near Taos, camp out in the Carson National Forest, maybe do some backpacking through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. It was quiet that time of year, early September, just after Labor Day, so most of the tourists had already left. Perfect time for peace and solitude. At least that's what I thought. I left Denver early in the morning, hit the road by 5 a.m., and got into Taos just after noon. I grabbed supplies, extra gas, more water, food, batteries, and then I drove out of town and took the forest road that led northeast. I had a spot in mind, some dead-end trail access point I found on an old forum post. No cell reception for miles. The road was rough and narrow, full of potholes and long switchbacks, and it took me almost 2 hours to reach the place I wanted to set up. It was perfect. A little pull-off with enough space for my truck, some flat ground to pitch my tent, and a stream a couple 100 feet away. Trees all around. You couldn't see anything past 10 yards without hitting brush. I got everything set up by late afternoon. I didn't bother with a fire since I had my little stove and it was warm out. I made food, walked the perimeter, and then just sat there for a while as the sun dropped. The quiet felt good at first. I felt alone in the best way. That night went smooth. No sounds except a few distant owls and one coyote I heard far off. I slept straight through. The second day, I woke up early, made coffee, and packed my day bag. I hiked a few miles north, following the stream. I found a good lookout point around noon, ate lunch there, and then took a different way back. I marked trees as I went, like always, and I didn't see a single person all day. No boot prints, no old trash. Just wilderness. That's what I'd come for. But when I got back to camp that afternoon, something felt a little off. My tent flap was open. I knew I had zipped it. I'm obsessive about things like that, especially since I've had squirrels and raccoons tear through my food in the past. I looked around, checked my gear. Nothing was missing, but the small bag where I kept my batteries and knife had been moved. I always keep it inside the tent, right at the foot of my sleeping bag. Now it was halfway under the side flap, as if it had been pulled or kicked. At first I thought maybe I hadn't zipped the tent. Maybe wind had blown it open. But the weather had been still all day, and I'd zipped the thing all the way down. It wasn't a gust that moved that bag. I knew that deep down. Still, I told myself it had to be something like that. A small animal, maybe. I didn't sleep well that night. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, I woke up sweating. The temperature had dropped and I'd zipped myself deep into my bag, but something pulled me awake. A sound, very faint, like breathing, not mine. I held my breath. It was close, just outside the tent. I waited, maybe 30 seconds. Then it was gone. I sat there in silence, not even daring to move. My hand found the knife in the side of my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep again until the sky started to lighten. And even then, it wasn't real sleep, just waiting for enough light to get up. When I finally stepped outside, the camp looked normal.
No prints.
Nothing out of place. But I knew what I'd heard. I should have left then, packed up and gone. But I didn't. I was tired and pissed at myself for getting scared. I told myself I imagined it. I made breakfast, filled my water bottles, and hiked west that day, following a ridge. I didn't go far, maybe 4 or 5 miles out. I stopped often and checked behind me. Paranoia had crept in, and it didn't go away. I kept having this feeling like I wasn't alone. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the brush made me stop and wait. On the way back, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Near where the ridge trail dropped down toward the stream, there were scuff marks in the dirt. Human-shaped, but not deep like footprints. Like someone had moved sideways through the brush without lifting their feet properly. I crouched down and looked at them. They weren't mine. They weren't boot prints either. Just disturbed earth and flattened grass in a narrow line. I looked around. Nothing. When I got back to camp, it was almost dusk. The tent was untouched. Everything was where I left it. But something was wrong again. I smelled it before I saw it. Something rotting, like old meat, thick and sour. It was faint, just enough to catch in my nose. I walked the area, checked every tree, every rock. Nothing. The smell faded after a few minutes. I kept turning around, expecting something to be behind me, but there was nothing. That night, I didn't even try to sleep right away. I sat up with my headlamp on, knife in my lap. Hours passed. Sometime after midnight, I started to drift off. My head nodded, eyes blinked shut. That's when I heard it. Not breathing this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy, one after another. They came from the side, from the tree line where the stream ran. I sat up, silent, holding my breath. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I swear I could feel the weight of someone standing there, inches away. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A voice, not words, just a mimicry, a high-pitched, broken attempt to sound like something human. A kind of half-laugh, half-choke, like someone trying to copy a laugh they'd only ever heard once. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The sound repeated once, then silence again. After what felt like hours, I finally heard the steps fade away, slower this time, going back into the trees. I didn't sleep. I packed my gear while it was still dark. I waited until dawn and then I left. But even as I walked, I felt it, that presence. It didn't go away. I kept turning around. I didn't eat, didn't rest, just walked. I made it back to the truck around noon. The second I threw my bag into the bed, I heard something move in the trees, just one crack of a branch. I didn't look. I got in, started the engine, and drove. Even as I bounced down that long forest road, I felt it, like someone was watching from behind the trees, someone who knew how to stay hidden. When I got into Taos, I filled up and drove straight back to Denver. Didn't talk to anyone. Didn't stop except for gas. I told myself I imagined it. I told myself maybe it was a mountain lion, maybe a poacher, maybe something that made sense. But I know what I heard. That broken mimic. That wasn't an animal. That was someone trying to be something they weren't. Something pretending to be human. I read later about people who go missing in those woods. Not tourists, locals, hunters, hikers, people who knew what they were doing. Most of the time, there's nothing left behind.
No gear.
No sign of struggle. Just gone. I never went back. I never will. Some people call it folklore, skinwalkers, but whatever it was real. Real enough to make me leave everything behind without looking back. I still camp, but I stay close to towns now. I keep cell service. I sleep with one ear open, and I never camp in New Mexico again. And when I hear a laugh out in the dark, I don't stay to listen. It was late September of 2014 when I did something I regret to this day. I was 27 at the time and had been traveling through Eastern Europe with a backpack and not much of a plan. I had left my job in Sheffield, England a few months earlier after a burnout episode that I hadn't seen coming until it was too late. Everything had felt off: routine, people, sounds. I needed to get away. I sold my car, gave up my lease, and flew to Budapest with barely enough gear to make it through cold nights. By the time I got to Romania, I was already used to sleeping in strange places. Train stations, barns, abandoned cottages. Felt like freedom. A lot of the locals I passed along the way didn't speak much English, and I didn't speak Romanian. But I liked it that way. The less I had to explain myself, the better. I had heard about a village somewhere in the north where there was a so-called happy graveyard. Sapanta, near the Ukraine border. The Merry Cemetery. The idea was that the grave markers were colorful and filled with poems about the dead, many of them lighthearted. It seemed so different from the cold stone slabs I was used to seeing. I had no plans to go there originally, but someone I met at a bus stop in Cluj told me it was worth the detour. I didn't go straight there. I took buses to smaller towns, stayed in a couple of cheap goose houses, and walked for hours through quiet hills and back roads. I never liked big cities anyway, and up there the hills felt untouched. By the time I reached the village near Sapanta, I had been walking for most of the day. My legs were shaking and my back was soaked with sweat under my pack. The village was smaller than I thought it would be. Maybe 40 or 50 homes spread over winding dirt roads, with chickens running across the fields and the occasional figure hunched over a garden. The air smelled like damp wood and burning leaves. I remember a small river cutting along the south edge and a rusted metal bridge that led to the main road. There was a fenced-off cemetery on the west side of the village, the one I'd heard about. But I wasn't expecting what I saw. The grave markers were tall wooden crosses, painted bright blue and decorated with carved faces, flowers, scenes from the dead people's lives. Some of them showed someone baking bread or cutting wood or holding a beer. I couldn't read the writing, but I stood there for a while staring at them. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I hadn't planned on sleeping there, not at first. I wandered out the back end of the cemetery, down a narrow footpath that curved into the hills. I had a tarp and a sleeping bag. If I could find a flat enough spot, I could make camp just for the night and move on in the morning. But there wasn't much, just brush, sloped ground, and damp fields. I thought about turning back, maybe trying to sleep under the bridge near the river, but that felt exposed. Eventually, I found a small patch of grass behind the far wall of the cemetery, near a cluster of overgrown trees. It was technically outside the graveyard fence, but right next to it, in a spot no one could see unless they were already looking for me. The ground was flat and dry, shielded by a few low-hanging branches. I set my tarp down, pulled out my bag, and sat for a while as the sky turned from gold to purple. The village had gone quiet.
No engines, no dogs barking.
Just the wind in the trees and the occasional click of branches against each other. There were no street lights nearby, no house lights. I could just barely make out the tops of the painted crosses over the wall. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, especially so close to a cemetery. I thought it might bother someone, even if the place didn't feel like it was visited much. There were no fresh flowers, no signs of recent maintenance. Still, I tried to be respectful. I lay down in my sleeping bag around 9 p.m., fully clothed except for my boots, and stared up at the canopy. Couldn't sleep. It wasn't fear. I camped in stranger places, but something felt off. The kind of off you can't explain. The kind that makes your skin feel too tight even when you're warm. Around 10:30, I heard movement. Not footsteps, more like dry grass being pushed aside. I stayed still. At first I thought maybe it was a deer or a stray dog. I turned my head just slightly toward the sound. It was coming from the other side of the cemetery wall, maybe 20 feet from where I lay. I waited. The sound came again, a dragging noise like something being pulled across the ground. Then silence. My first instinct was to sit up and look, but I've always been the kind of person who freezes when something doesn't make sense. I lay still, barely breathing. A few minutes passed. Then I heard the sound of metal creaking, like an old gate being pushed open. But the main gate was on the other side of the cemetery, nowhere near me. There shouldn't have been any gates near the back wall. I hadn't seen one earlier. Then it hit me. There was a smaller, rusted iron gate in the far corner. I'd seen it earlier when I walked around. It looked locked, but maybe it wasn't. I stayed down and tried to calm my breathing. I told myself it was probably a local, maybe someone visiting a grave at night. Some people have traditions like that. Maybe it wasn't anything strange. But then the footsteps started. Heavy ones, not fast but deliberate, crunching over gravel, then dead leaves, then softer grass. I couldn't tell how many there were. Maybe just one person, but the weight of them didn't sound right. They were too spaced out, too slow, like someone taking long steps while carrying something heavy. I rolled slowly to one side so I could peek through a gap in the branches. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the edge of the graveyard, just behind one of the blue crosses. Not moving, just standing. He was tall, taller than average, wearing something like a coat or long jacket that hung almost to his knees. His head was tilted slightly down, and he was facing one of the graves. I couldn't see his face. The shadows were too thick, and he never turned. I watched him for what felt like 10 minutes, maybe longer. He didn't move once. Then, just when I was about to look away, he knelt. He slowly lowered himself down, almost mechanically, and put something on the grave. I thought it might be a candle, but there was no light. He stayed there, hunched, unmoving. I thought I should move, quietly roll away, pack my things, and leave. But I was scared to make any noise. Something in me kept saying, "Don't let him know you're here." I couldn't explain why I felt that way, but I listened to it. Another 10 minutes passed. Then he stood again, turned, walked back the way he came, but not toward the small gate. He moved through the graves slowly, in a zigzagging path, stopping at some, skipping others. His head turned at odd angles, like he was looking for something. And then, very suddenly, he stopped. He was facing directly toward the corner where I was hidden. I was sure he couldn't see me. It was too dark, and I was completely still, but something in my body locked up anyway. He stayed that way for a long time, staring straight ahead. Then he took a step forward. Just one. Then another. My body screamed at me to move, but I didn't. Not yet. He took a third step, still staring forward. Then he stopped again. He reached into his coat and pulled something out. I couldn't see what it was, but he dropped it on the ground near a grave. Then he turned and walked back toward the small gate. I listened hard for the sound of the metal creaking again, and after about a minute, I heard it. Then nothing.
No footsteps. No breathing.
No movement. I waited another 20 minutes before I moved. My legs were stiff and my fingers were numb, even though it wasn't cold. I slowly packed up my sleeping bag and tarp, making as little noise as I could. I didn't stand. I crawled backward from the tree cover, out toward the footpath, and didn't stop moving until I reached the river. I crossed the metal bridge and walked 3 more kilometers along the road to the next village, using only the moonlight to guide me. I didn't use my torch. I didn't look back once. I found a bus stop with a roof and slept on the bench. I didn't sleep much, but it felt safer than that cemetery. The next morning, I walked back. I didn't plan to go inside the cemetery again, but something kept pulling me. The small gate was shut, still rusty, still looked locked, but the grass on the inside of it had been trampled recently, and there were fresh footprints in the dirt. I walked along the outer wall until I found the grave where he had stopped and dropped something. There was a folded piece of cloth on the ground. Black, worn, looked like part of a coat lining. But underneath it was a small pile of dirt that had clearly been dug recently, right on top of the grave. No tools, just fingers probably, but there was no hole, just loose dirt, like someone had dug into it, then packed it back down again. That was the last time I went near that graveyard. I hitched a ride out of the village and didn't look back. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what that man was doing or what he was looking for. Maybe he was mourning someone. Maybe he was mentally unwell. Or maybe he was doing something much worse. But I've never camped near a graveyard again. And I never will. It was August of 2012 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 32 back then, working as a forklift mechanic in Leicester. I hadn't taken a proper break in over a year, and the stress had been building up. I didn't want to go anywhere crowded or expensive. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you only find in the woods. So, I packed up my old green hiking pack, threw my tent and gear into the boot of my car, and drove north. I ended up in a remote part of the Lake District, somewhere west of Ullswater but far from any tourist spot. I hadn't picked out an exact site. I just followed a narrow road past the last sheep farms until the pavement turned to gravel. After about half an hour down that stretch, I found a dirt pull-off near a trail that wasn't marked on any maps I had. It looked old and mostly unused, more like a deer path than a proper trail. That's what made me stop. Felt like exactly what I wanted, completely off-grid. I parked the car, took a long look around, and hiked in. It was around 3 in the afternoon when I started walking. The forest was dense, mostly pine and birch, and the air smelled fresh in that way it only does far from roads. No sounds of cars, just birds, wind, and the occasional creak from the trees. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found a flat clearing about 50 yards off the trail. It sat beside a small ridge, with thick trees to the west and a slope that dropped down into a dry streambed. There was enough space for my tent, and I could see sky through the trees. I liked that. I could watch the stars at night. I pitched my tent, laid out my sleeping mat and bag, and set up my little butane stove to make some tea. I had no phone signal, which I expected. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going, just that I was going north for a few days. That part was maybe a bit stupid. Still, that first night felt peaceful. I ate some instant noodles, drank tea, and sat outside watching the light drain from the sky. Around midnight, the temperature dropped fast, so I zipped myself into my bag and fell asleep to the sound of wind brushing through the pine branches. The next morning, I woke up around 7. My back was stiff, and the ground had gotten colder overnight than I thought it would. I stretched, unzipped the tent, and boiled water for coffee. It was quiet, too quiet maybe. The birdsong I'd heard the day before was gone. I remember standing there holding my enamel mug, looking around and thinking, it's just too early, maybe. But that feeling stayed with me. Still, I went about the day as planned. I hiked farther into the woods with my compass, marking trees with bits of red tape so I wouldn't get turned around. I saw deer prints, a few old rabbit holes, and even what looked like badger tracks. It was wild country, untouched. I liked that. That evening, as the sun started to fall, I headed back to camp. That's when I first noticed something that made me stop cold. Footprint. It was near one of the trees I had marked with tape, about 100 yards from my tent. It wasn't mine. I wear size 10 hiking boots with a thick tread. This print was smaller, narrower, and flatter. No tread pattern, just a smooth sole like from an old trainer or even a loafer. It looked recent. The edges weren't broken down by wind or leaves. I stared at it for a good minute before I kept walking. When I got back to the tent, everything was exactly where I left it. Nothing looked disturbed. Still, I felt watched. I didn't want to admit it then. I just told myself it was my mind overreacting. I boiled some more water and ate a protein bar for dinner. I didn't feel hungry. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I started to doze off, I'd hear something. A snap of a twig, a scuff, the wind pushing the tent wall. But each time I unzipped the flap and shined my torch outside, there was nothing. No eyes in the dark. No figures. Nothing. But the feeling stayed with me. A low buzz at the base of my neck, like I was being stared at from the woods. By sunrise, I was exhausted. My hands were shaking when I lit the stove, and I spilled half the water trying to make coffee. I knew then I had to leave. I packed everything up by 9 a.m., but before I left, I walked around the edge of my camp. I don't know why, just something told me to check. And that's when I saw it. A second footprint. This one closer to the ridge. Same type as before, narrow, smooth-soled, angled slightly toward the camp. It was half hidden under pine needles, but it hadn't been there the day before. I would have seen it. I know I would have. I froze. I looked up at the ridge, then back at the print. My whole body tensed. My ears were ringing. I didn't hear birds, or wind, or anything. Just silence. I didn't run. I wanted to, but I didn't. I walked back to my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and started moving as calmly as I could down the same trail I had come up. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. It was around noon when I got back to the car. The gravel road was just as empty as I left it. I unlocked the car and threw my gear in. Before I got in, I turned to look at the tree line one last time, and that's when I saw him, about 30 feet into the woods. A man, standing still. He wasn't dressed for hiking.
No pack, no coat.
Just a dark brown jacket, pale jeans, and shoes too light for the forest. His arms were at his sides. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He didn't shout. He just stared. His face was hard to make out in the shade, but I could see he had short hair, maybe graying. Average height, average build. Nothing strange about his look, but everything strange about the way he was there. No one should have been out there. That trail wasn't on any maps, and he hadn't made a sound. I got in the car and locked the doors. I didn't peel out. I just turned around slowly, drove down the gravel road, and didn't stop until I hit tarmac again. When I got back to the main road, I felt a bit calmer. I convinced myself it was probably a hunter, or a hiker who didn't care much for proper boots. Someone weird, maybe, but harmless. I tried to let it go, but I couldn't. A week later, I looked up everything I could about that area. Nothing.
No disappearances.
No reports. No known hermits. It wasn't protected land. It wasn't even popular. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he had followed me, that those footprints were warnings, that the man I saw was the same one who had walked around my tent in the night. I never went back there. I still camp sometimes, but never alone. I always tell people exactly where I'm going. I carry a satellite phone now, and I double-check every trail I use. But it doesn't help me sleep better, because every now and then, just as I'm drifting off, I think about how close that man must have come. I think about how quiet he was, how careful, and I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night, or if I had woken up just a bit slower. It was September 2017. I was 31. I just quit my job in Sheffield after nearly 8 years stuck behind a desk. I didn't leave on bad terms or anything. I just hit a wall the way people do when they realize their time's getting chewed up by things they don't care about. The morning I handed in my notice, I booked a 3-week solo camping trip across parts of Northumberland. I wanted fresh air, silence, and space. On the second week, I found myself driving east in my dusty old Subaru, following a winding road that cut through a narrow valley full of low pine trees and rock-strewn fields. I had no signal for miles. I didn't care. I liked it better that way.
No distractions.
Just the sound of tires crunching on gravel and the steady hum of the engine. I'd been told about Halbert Lake by a man I met outside a petrol station 2 days earlier. He looked like he'd spent his whole life outdoors. Sun-scorched cheeks, fingers stained with soil and oil, eyes that didn't blink too often. He told me about a ridge above the lake where no one went anymore. Said it used to be a logging spot in the 70s before they fenced it off. He didn't say why it was abandoned. He just said it was a great place for a quiet camp. I looked it up on the OS map I kept in the glove box. The ridge wasn't marked, but the lake was. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest village, down an old forestry track that barely showed on newer maps. I figured I'd give it a try. If it was rubbish, I'd move on. But when I arrived, it didn't look rubbish. It looked perfect. The track narrowed as I went deeper into the forest. I had to get out 3 times to move fallen branches. After a while, the trail just ended at a small clearing with a steep hill in front of it. I parked the car, grabbed my gear, tent, food, water, stove, all of it, and made my way up the hill. It wasn't too high, but the climb was rough. Moss-covered rocks slipped underfoot. Brambles caught on my trouser legs. But when I got to the top, I saw the lake through the trees, and it was worth it. Halbert Lake was still.
No birds.
No wind. Just a long, dark body of water surrounded by pine and birch. The ridge ran along the north side, a perfect natural balcony. I picked a flat spot about 20 meters back from the edge, nestled between 3 tall trees. I pitched my tent, set up my little camp stove, and sat there eating cold beans out of a tin while the sun dropped below the treeline. That first night was uneventful. I heard the usual forest sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but nothing out of the ordinary. I slept light, which I usually do when camping alone, but I didn't feel unsafe, just aware. The next morning, I woke to soft rain tapping the nylon above me. It smelled like earth and pine and wet stone. I made coffee, boiled eggs, and sat facing the lake, watching low clouds skim across the water like smoke. I spent most of the day exploring the ridge and nearby trails. I found old markers nailed to trees, small orange plastic squares faded by decades of weather. I guess they were from the logging days. I even found a few rusted barrels and a cracked fiberglass helmet half buried in soil near a dead tree. It looked like no one had been there in years. That night, something changed. Started around 2 a.m. I was half awake, lying on my side in the tent, when I felt a thud. Not a loud one, more like a faint vibration under the ground. I froze and listened. A second thud came a few seconds later. Then another. They were spaced out, deliberate. I sat up and pulled my boots on. My torch was clipped to the roof of the tent, and I switched it on without unzipping the flap yet. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. I unzipped the tent and poked my head out. The air was thick, still raining but barely. Just a mist now. I scanned the trees. Nothing moved. The forest was too quiet.
No owls.
No wind. Not even the rustle of small animals. Felt wrong. I stepped outside, torch beam cutting through the gray. My breath floated out in clouds. The ground was soaked, but I couldn't see any fresh footprints. I walked toward the edge of the ridge where the tree line opened up to a view of the lake. Still nothing. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes before heading back. Just before I zipped the tent shut again, I looked behind me. A small branch, no thicker than my finger, lay across the spot where I'd been sitting earlier by the stove. It hadn't been there before. I left it there, crawled back inside. Didn't sleep. Next morning, I checked around my camp. No tracks, no signs of anyone. Maybe I imagined it, I told myself. Maybe the thuds were just natural, small landslides, animals, anything. But I knew better. I camped alone plenty of times. I knew the difference between a rabbit and something that walks upright. That afternoon, I hiked west along the ridge to find better phone signal. After nearly 2 hours, I got a faint bar and managed to download a basic satellite map. It showed something odd. A clearing deeper in the woods, not far from the ridge, but not marked on my physical map. I hadn't noticed it before. I decided to check it out. It was hard to find, but I got there eventually. The trees thinned, and I saw an old foundation. Cement blocks, moss-covered, in a rough square. There were remnants of charred wood in the center. Looked like a small cabin used to stand there. Nearby, half hidden in tall grass, I found a buried oil drum with a torn black tarp wrapped around it. The inside was scorched, like someone had burned something in it, then tried to hide it. I didn't like the feel of the place. It was too quiet, and the air smelled wrong, like rust and wet ash. I left and got back to my camp by early evening. That night, I didn't light a fire, just ate cold food and kept the torch close. I moved my tent back a bit, closer to the trees. Felt safer somehow, but it wasn't. That third night, I heard breathing. Not mine, not an animal's. It came from outside the tent, slow and steady. I froze and held my breath to listen better. The sound stopped. Then I heard a single soft crunch of leaves, about a meter away. I stayed absolutely still for what felt like an hour. Then the breathing started again, this time further off. Softer, then silence. In the morning, I found something tied to a branch outside my tent. A bundle of pine needles bound tightly with a strip of cloth. Dirty, dark cloth like it had been soaked in oil or blood at some point. I didn't touch it, just looked at it for a long time. My brain started making connections I didn't want it to make. This wasn't random. Someone had been out there, watching, following, leaving signs. I made the decision to leave.
I packet fast.
Everything went into the bags as it was, wet or not. I didn't care. I made the descent from the ridge in less than 20 minutes, slipping twice, scraping my palms, cutting my knee on a sharp rock. When I reached the car, something clicked in my chest, like a switch. I fumbled the keys, unlocked it, and threw my stuff in the back. That's when I noticed the boot was already unlatched. It had been opened. Nothing was missing, but I had closed it when I arrived. I was sure of it. I drove, didn't stop until I hit a main road with proper lighting. I stayed in a cheap hotel that night in Alnwick. Didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about that oil drum, the breathing, the cloth bundle, the thuds, the footprints I didn't see, the man at the petrol station. I never went back to Halbert Lake. I told people it was too remote, too quiet, which was true, just not in the way they thought. 6 months later, I looked up that area online again. I wanted to know more. I found an old report from the early 90s about an illegal hunting operation busted by the police. Men trapping deer, badgers, even dogs, in makeshift cages near the lake. There were mentions of poaching camps. One was on the ridge. The report said they found the camp burned.
No suspects. No arrests.
That was enough for me. To this day, I don't know who was out there, but someone was, and they didn't want company. I was 32 when it happened, and I still think about it more than I should. It was late September 2017, right before the cold really starts to take over the evenings in the north of England. I'd taken a few weeks off work, not for any particular reason, just time I'd saved up and needed to burn before the end of the year. I wasn't married, no kids, lived alone in Leeds in a flat that was more functional than it was cozy. I spent most of my life staring at screens, replying to emails that barely mattered, trying to convince myself I was doing okay. I needed some space, real space, away from all the routines and blinking lights. I didn't want to go abroad or stay in a hotel, just wanted to go off-grid for a while. Camping seemed like the best idea. Not the kind of camping where you park in a nice, flat campsite with electric hookups and families everywhere. I mean proper wild camping, out in the woods by myself, no phone signal, no people. I looked up a few places and ended up picking a spot near Kielder Forest in Northumberland. It's one of the most remote areas in England. A huge, dark forest that stretches almost to the Scottish border, with long dirt roads and open moorland that looks the same for miles. If you head far enough off the main track, you can go days without seeing anyone. I loaded up my car, tent, sleeping bag, water, gas stove, some food, and drove up on a Thursday. It took about 4 hours from Leeds, including a stop for petrol. The sun was already dipping by the time I pulled off the main road and onto one of the forestry trails that wound deep into the trees. I drove for about 15 minutes until the track became too rough for my car. I parked in a shallow ditch, locked up, and carried my gear on foot into the woods. I didn't use a GPS or anything. I had a paper map and that was enough. I just kept walking until I couldn't hear the road anymore. The air was heavy with pine, and the ground was soft and damp. I found a flat spot about 100 yards from a small stream and pitched my tent there. No signs of other campers, just squirrels, a few crows, and the rustling of trees in the wind. It was peaceful. That first night I cooked some pasta, listened to the sound of water trickling over stones, and lay in my sleeping bag with a book and a torch. I slept surprisingly well, the kind of sleep you only get when your body is actually tired and your brain isn't full of nonsense. The next day, I hiked around for a while, explored a bit, and sat by the stream. I didn't see a single person, not even footprints, just trees and moss and the occasional rabbit darting off into the brush. I felt like I'd done the right thing, disconnected from the world, clearing my head, doing something real for once. But that night was different. It was maybe 2 a.m. when I first heard the sound. A soft crunching, like boots stepping slowly on leaves. Not fast, not heavy, just steady, careful steps coming from somewhere behind my tent. I froze. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps were too deliberate, too rhythmic. They paused for a few seconds, then continued, then paused again. I lay there holding my breath. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move, just listened. The steps circled halfway around the tent, then stopped. I couldn't hear breathing or anything else, just silence. I lay like that for at least half an hour, completely still, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, I must have drifted off out of pure exhaustion. In the morning, I checked around the tent. No obvious tracks, just a few areas where the pine needles had been disturbed. Could have been anything. I tried to tell myself it was a fox, maybe a badger, something like that. But in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't. Still, I stayed. I didn't want to pack up just because I'd spooked myself. The day passed slowly. I didn't venture far, just gathered some firewood, made tea, and sat watching the stream. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I went to bed early, kept my torch within reach, and didn't even try to sleep at first. Just lay there listening. The wind picked up around midnight, rustling the trees in long, low waves. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was hearing the sound again. Footsteps. This time they were closer and slower, not circling now, just standing, right outside the tent. I didn't breathe. My eyes were wide open, staring into the darkness of the tent roof. My heart thudding so loud it felt like it would give me away. I reached for the torch, switched it on, and aimed it at the fabric wall. Nothing, just the inside of the tent glowing yellow.
No shadow.
No shape, but I knew someone was there. I stayed like that for an hour, maybe more. Eventually, I convinced myself to unzip the tent. Slowly, quietly, I pulled it open and flashed the torch outside. Nothing, no one, but I could smell something faint, like old sweat, like someone had been standing there a few seconds ago. I stepped out, torch sweeping side to side. Still nothing. The trees stood silently, swaying a little in the wind. My breath fogged in the cold air. I turned in a full circle, shining the beam across the undergrowth. Then I saw it. A shape, half hidden behind a tree maybe 20 yards away. Just the side of a man's leg, dark trousers, boots, retreating slowly behind the trunk, like he didn't want to be seen. I held the torch steady on that tree for minutes. Didn't move, didn't speak, and he didn't come out again. Eventually, I backed into the tent, zipped it shut, and sat there the rest of the night, torch on, knife in my lap. I didn't sleep, not a second. By morning, the clouds were low and gray. Everything felt damp and dead. I packed up quickly, barely touched my food, and left the spot. But I didn't go back to the car. I didn't want to lead whoever that was back to it. Instead, I hiked east, deeper into the forest, staying off the main paths, hoping to lose anyone who might have been watching. By afternoon, I found a new spot, smaller, tighter, surrounded by denser trees. Felt safer, more hidden. I stayed there that night, too exhausted to be scared. I thought maybe I'd imagine the whole thing, stress, isolation, sleep deprivation. But the next morning, I found the cigarette, half smoked, wedged into a split in the bark of a tree right next to where I'd pitched the tent. Still fresh, still warm. Someone had been there less than an hour ago. That was when I stopped pretending it was just in my head. I didn't even pack properly. Just shoved everything into my rucksack and took off, this time heading south. Back toward the road, back to the car. I didn't stop for water, didn't eat, just walked. I kept turning around, checking the trail behind me, ducking under branches, moving fast. After 2 hours, I made it back to the car. But something was wrong. There were new marks on the ground beside the ditch, fresh boot prints. Larger than mine, deeper. Someone had been there, maybe even waiting. There was mud on the driver's side door, a fingerprint near the handle. I unlocked the car, jumped in, and drove. Didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached a petrol station with cameras and people and lights. That was the end of my trip. I didn't report it. What would I even say? That someone stood near my tent and watched me sleep? That a man followed me through the woods? There wasn't anything concrete, no attack, no theft. Just silence and shadows. But I knew what I saw, and I'll never forget the shape of that leg disappearing behind the tree. The smell in the air, the sound of footsteps moving with care. Not rushing, not panicked, confident, deliberate. Whoever that was, he wanted me to know he was there, and he wanted me to leave. I've never been camping alone again, not once. I still hike, still love the outdoors, but I stay near people now. Campsites, cabins, places with locks. And sometimes, when I'm walking in the woods, I still find myself glancing behind the trees, just in case he's there again, watching, waiting. I was 31 that year, and I'd been living in Memphis for about 6 months. Work had been stressful, my apartment felt cramped, and the noise of the city was starting to get to me. I'd grown up in a quieter part of Missouri, where you could walk for an hour and not see a single soul. That kind of stillness had always helped me think. So I decided to take a few days off and just get out of town. I packed my old camping gear, filled up my cooler with ice, bought a few gas cans, and headed west into Arkansas. I wasn't following a strict plan. I liked to explore, to turn off on smaller roads and just keep driving until something caught my eye. That's how I'd always found the best spots. I'd loaded up some offline maps, grabbed a paper atlas just in case, and headed for the Ozarks. I'd been out there before, but never that deep into the woods. Around the third day of driving, I found myself following an old stretch of highway that barely seemed used anymore. It wasn't on the main map, and the pavement was cracked and overgrown in places. But it looked peaceful. After about 20 miles of winding up and down hills and seeing nothing but trees, I came across a wide patch of land just off the road. It had an old wooden fence that had mostly fallen apart and what looked like the remains of a small gas station. There was no roof on the place anymore, just 4 concrete walls and weeds growing all over the lot. The pumps had been ripped out and only their rusted bases remained. But the land around it was flat, quiet, and tucked away from the road. I figured it'd be a good place to park the truck and camp out for a night or two. I hadn't seen another car for over an hour, so I didn't think anyone would bother me. I set up my tent about 30 yards behind the old building, near a cluster of trees. I made a small fire pit with rocks and used some fallen limbs to get it going. I had packed plenty of food, simple stuff like canned chili, jerky, and trail mix. I even brought a small portable stove and a steel pot so I could heat up some coffee in the mornings. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire for a while, listened to the wind rustle through the trees, and watched the stars. I slept pretty well, too. The next morning, I boiled some water, made coffee, and walked around the lot to check things out. Behind the building was a trail, or what used to be one. It was overgrown and filled with dead leaves and sticks, but you could tell people had walked it long ago. I didn't go far, just far enough to see that it led down into a gully and then curved out of sight. It was strange how isolated it all felt. No sounds of cars, no planes overhead, not even any birds that morning. Just the wind and the creaking of trees. It didn't bother me at first. I actually liked the quiet, but things changed the second night. Around midnight, I woke up. No real reason. I wasn't cold, and nothing had made a noise that I could remember. I just opened my eyes and felt wrong. It was that kind of wrong where your body already knows something's off before your brain catches up. I sat up in my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent door just enough to peek out. It was pitch black outside. The fire had burned out hours earlier. I usually kept my flashlight next to my sleeping bag, but it wasn't there. I looked around, felt along the tent floor, but came up empty. I figured I must have left it outside when I went to take a piss before bed. So I waited, just sat there, half inside the sleeping bag, staring out into the dark. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything either. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt like someone was nearby. I didn't think it was an animal. I camped enough to know what that felt like. This felt different, heavier somehow. Eventually I laid back down, zipped the tent shut, and told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It wasn't easy falling back asleep, but I must have, because the next thing I remember was sunlight pushing through the nylon walls of the tent. That morning, I found the flashlight lying on the other side of the fire pit. I had no memory of putting it there, and what really got to me was the boot print in the dirt next to it. It wasn't mine. Mine had a rounded heel and a smaller tread pattern. This one had a square heel, deep lugs, and looked a size or two bigger. There hadn't been any rain, so the print was clear, pointed toward the tent. I just stood there staring at it for a while, not moving. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to panic, but there was no good reason for that print to be there. I didn't hear anyone come by, didn't hear footsteps, voices, nothing. Whoever made it had come by while I was asleep. I didn't want to assume the worst, but I also wasn't going to stick around long enough to find out if they were coming back. I packed up fast, stuffed my sleeping bag, folded the tent, threw everything into the back of the truck in a hurry. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get the hell out, but the truck wouldn't start. I turned the key and nothing happened. The dash lit up, but the engine didn't crank. I tried again and again. Still nothing. I checked the battery cables, they were fine. Nothing was corroded. I just filled the gas tank the day before, so it wasn't that either. I popped the hood and looked over everything I could. But I'm no mechanic. It all looked fine to me. No cut wires, no missing parts. But for some reason, it wouldn't even turn over. So there I was, alone, miles from anyone, and now stranded. I tried to calm myself down and think clearly. I had a satellite GPS tracker in my gear bag, one of those little yellow ones with an SOS button. But when I dug it out and turned it on, the screen wouldn't light up. Just blinked once and died. Dead battery. I could have sworn I charged it before I left, but maybe I didn't. Or maybe something drained it. Either way, it was useless now. That left walking. I grabbed my backpack, filled it with a few essentials. Knife, water bottle, snacks, map, and compass, and headed east on the road I came in on. My plan was to walk until I got back to the last town I'd passed, which I guessed was around 20 miles back. Not great, but doable. I figured I'd find someone eventually, or at least get back into cell range. After maybe 3 hours of walking, I heard something behind me. It was faint, but I stopped and turned around. Nothing, just the empty road winding through the trees. I waited, stared for a long time, then kept walking. An hour later, I heard it again. This time it was clearer. Not just one sound, but several, like the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. I turned around fast and scanned the trees. Still nothing. I picked up the pace. Around late afternoon, I saw something that made me stop cold. There was an old black pickup parked on the side of the road up ahead. Not my truck, a different make and model. It looked like it hadn't moved in years. Covered in dust, weeds growing through the bumper, one tire flat. But I swear to God, when I got closer, I saw fresh mud prints around the driver's side door. Big prints. Same tread pattern as the one by my tent. I didn't go near it. I stayed on the far side of the road, walked past slowly, and didn't look inside. I just wanted to keep moving. By sunset, I was dead tired. My legs hurt, my feet were blistered, and I still hadn't seen a single other car or person. I decided to make camp just off the road and rest for the night. Not ideal, but I didn't have much choice. I set up my tarp between two trees and laid down in the sleeping bag, knife in my hand. I barely slept. Every twig that cracked, every breeze through the branches. I jumped, and at one point, I was sure I heard breathing nearby. Not an animal's breath. Human. But when I turned on my headlamp and scanned the woods, there was nothing. Morning finally came. I didn't waste time packing. I just rolled everything up fast, shoved it into the pack, and kept walking. By noon, I started seeing signs of civilization. Faded road signs, old billboards, a rusted guardrail. Then I saw a mailbox, then another, then finally, a small gas station with a convenience store. I stumbled inside, half-starved, half-dehydrated, and bought water, jerky, and a soda. I asked the clerk where I was. He told me I was still in Arkansas, about 30 miles south of a town called Jasper. He asked where I'd come from, and when I described the area with the abandoned station, he went quiet. He said nobody goes out there anymore, that the road used to lead to a small mining town that shut down in the early 90s. Said folks who camp there either get lost or don't come back. I didn't ask him to explain. I just nodded, bought more water, and asked if he could call a tow truck for my truck. We drove back later that day. My truck was still there, but something was off. There were scratches along the driver's door, like someone had dragged a sharp tool across it. Not deep enough to ruin the paint, but clear enough to see. The gas cap was missing, too. We popped the hood again, and now the battery cables were cut. Clean, sharp cuts like they'd been done with a knife. The mechanic got quiet and said he didn't want to hang around too long. We got the truck onto the flatbed and drove out of there. I didn't say much on the way back. I didn't tell him about the boot prints, or the footsteps, or the flashlight, or the sound of breathing in the woods. But I knew, in the back of my mind, that I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been watching me, moving around my camp, messing with my truck, and they knew I'd be back with help. I sold the truck not long after. I haven't gone camping since, and I never, ever take random side roads anymore. I was 32 when I decided to spend a few days hiking and camping alone in the Lake District in England. It was the middle of September 2019, just cool enough to keep the midges down, but not cold enough to make it miserable. I'd booked time off work months before, just to get a bit of quiet. My head was fried from the usual routine. Office lights, email chains, the same lunch every day, the same faces, same fake smiles. I didn't want people. I wanted wind and mud and trees. I'd done a few solo hikes before, mostly in Scotland and Wales, but this time I picked a more isolated route. Not the usual tourist-friendly spots. I found a trail online that wasn't even listed on the big sites. It was mentioned in an old forum post from 2012, buried under years of inactivity. A few people talked about it as a forgotten path that ran above Ennerdale Water and stretched towards some dense woodland in a lesser-known section of the national park. No mobile signal out there, no marked campsites, just rough trails, fallen branches, uneven ground, and the kind of quiet you don't get anywhere else. I parked my car in a lay-by off a narrow road, well away from the known car parks. There were no signs nearby, nothing that screamed, official start of hike. That's what I wanted. The beginning of something that felt untouched. I strapped on my pack, tent, food, gas stove, everything I needed for 3 days and started uphill. The trail was there, but barely. It looked like it hadn't been walked in years. Sometimes it disappeared entirely under tall ferns or wet leaves, and I had to stop and look for the groove in the ground again. The first few hours were hard. I twisted my ankle slightly on a wet rock, and the air had that heavy smell of soil and old rain. But I liked it, that struggle to find where you were going. It made it feel real. By the time I set up camp that first night, I was exhausted. I found a flat spot under a cluster of twisted oaks that leaned together like old men whispering. There was no one around for miles. No distant chatter, no headlights, nothing. Just the sound of wind through the leaves and the occasional rustle of something small moving through undergrowth. I set up the tent, cooked some noodles, and sat with my back against a tree until it got dark enough that I couldn't see my own hands. I slept well that night. No dreams, just deep, heavy sleep like I'd melted into the ground. When I woke up, the air was cold and damp. My boots were wet from dew, and my breath came out in white mist. I made some coffee on the little stove and looked over my paper map. I wanted to make it into the woods I'd seen on the edge of the satellite photo. That was my goal, somewhere no one else bothered to reach. The second day's hike was rougher. The trail disappeared entirely for long stretches. I had to rely on compass readings and gut feeling. The trees got thicker.
Taller, to.
Pines mostly, with sharp needles and branches that scraped against my arms. There was a part of the trail where the light barely made it through. I didn't like that stretch. It made my skin crawl a little, though I couldn't say why. I pushed through it fast and kept moving until the ground opened up again into a narrow valley. That night, I set up camp beside a shallow stream. The water was slow and clear, moving over smooth stones. I filled my bottle and set it to boil. Everything was still. Not quiet, because the woods are never really quiet, but still, like things were watching. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up more than once, even though there was nothing out there. I kept telling myself that. Nothing out there. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I don't know what stirred me. Maybe a noise. Maybe a dream I don't remember. but I sat up in my sleeping bag and just listened. No wind, no birds, no water sounds, just silence. My ears rang from how silent it was. Then I heard something, a soft crunch. Not close, not far, just somewhere out there. A single footstep on dry leaves. Then nothing. I lay back down slowly and stared up at the dark shape of the tent ceiling. My heart thudded in my chest. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a fox, maybe just a branch dropping. I lay there for a long time, eyes wide, barely breathing. I didn't sleep after that. Not properly. Just dozed off in short bursts, waking up again every time I heard something too soft to place. The next morning, I found a small pile of stones near the edge of my campsite. They weren't there the night before. 5 or 6 flat rocks stacked neatly on top of each other, no more than 6 inches high. They looked placed, intentionally, balanced carefully. I stared at them for a long time. Then I kicked them over, not out of anger. I just didn't want them there. I hiked into the forest that day, deeper than I'd planned to go. The trees closed in more. The air felt heavier. I couldn't see the sky anymore. The ground turned soft, spongy under my boots, and I found myself walking over patches of moss that gave with every step. There were signs of old logging at some point, rusted metal buried in bark, and a broken frame of what might have once been a shelter or cabin. I started getting that feeling again, that I wasn't alone. At one point, I thought I saw someone through the trees, just a shape between 2 trunks, standing still. When I looked again, it was gone. My chest tightened. I tried to laugh it off, told myself it was just shadow and light. But then I found another stack of stones, this one bigger, 12 or 15 rocks, carefully arranged, right in the middle of the trail. I didn't touch this one, just walked wide around it and kept moving. I didn't want to camp in the woods that night, but I was too far in to turn back. I set up the tent in a clearing that felt slightly less claustrophobic. I didn't cook anything, didn't light anything, just crawled into the sleeping bag and lay still. That night, I heard more footsteps. Not fast, not running, just slow, deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch, closer this time. I held my breath until my lungs hurt. The sound stopped eventually, but I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent and found something that made me go cold. A piece of twine, thin, brown, almost like old fishing line, had been tied to the zipper of my tent, loosely but clearly done on purpose. A loop, not a knot, just enough to show someone had touched it. I packed up immediately. No breakfast, no map checking. I just wanted out. But going back the way I came wasn't easy. The trail had changed. Or maybe I'd just lost it. Everything looked the same. Same trees, same moss, same faint paths. I started moving faster, pushing through branches, sliding on roots. My ankle started to hurt again, worse than before. Then I saw him. There was a man standing about 20 meters ahead, just standing there, still as a statue. He was dressed in dark green, blending into the trees, but his skin stood out pale against the bark. His face was expressionless. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just watched me. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. Then I turned and ran in the opposite direction. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just ran. Branches slapped against my arms and face. My pack bounced hard on my back. I stumbled more than once but didn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out and I fell, chest heaving, onto a slope of ferns and wet grass. I lay there trying to listen. Nothing behind me, no footsteps, no voices, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still close. I pushed on in a different direction. Kept moving until the trees started to thin and I could see light breaking through. I found a stream I didn't recognize and followed it downhill for hours. Eventually, I hit a gravel path. Not the one I came in on, but something man-made. I followed that, limping for what felt like forever. Sometime late that evening, I reached a sheep farm. The old man who lived there took one look at me and opened the gate without saying a word. I must have looked rough, mud-caked, scratched up, wide-eyed like a cornered animal. He gave me water and let me use his landline to call for a taxi. I didn't explain anything. I couldn't find the words, and he didn't ask. I've never been back to that part of the Lake District. I don't even look at photos of it. I still have the map, though, the one I used. I've studied it more times than I can count, trying to figure out where I was, how I lost the trail, where that man could have come from. But I don't think it matters anymore. What matters is I trusted the woods too much. Thought I could handle whatever they held just because I had a compass and a tent. But some places don't care about your gear or your plans. They're wild in ways we've forgotten. And some people live in those places. They don't want to be found, and they don't want you there. It was the summer of 2011, and I had just turned 27. I wasn't married, no kids. I was working as a surveyor for a small company out of Derby. My life had slipped into a kind of boring rhythm. Office work, weekends in the pub, the odd visit to my brother's place in Leeds. I needed to break it. I'd been feeling this itch for something solitude, maybe. Something where I didn't have to talk to anyone or explain anything. I thought maybe a weekend camping trip might do the trick. I didn't want to go to a site full of caravans or screaming kids, and I didn't want anything that had toilets or electric hookups. I wanted isolation, real quiet. I found a place online, not a campground, but a bit of land owned by a sheep farmer in North Yorkshire. You could pay him 20 quid to camp anywhere on the back end of his land for the weekend. No amenities, just open fields, thin forests, and old trails. Sounded perfect. The listing said there were no other regular campers that weekend either, which sealed the deal. I packed the basics: tent, sleeping bag, gas stove, knife, flashlight, compass, a couple bottles of water, and some food. Kept it light. I wasn't going out there to hike or explore. I just wanted to be alone. It took me about 3 hours to drive up from Derby, winding through smaller and smaller roads until I was in the middle of nowhere. Just hills, sheep, and endless fields. I met the farmer, a guy named Neil, probably in his late 60s. He had a cigarette stuck to his lip the entire time and never really looked me in the eye. He pointed out the direction of the trail and told me to follow the fence line until I passed a small stone bridge. After that, I could go wherever I wanted. I thanked him and started the walk out. The path was quiet. It wound along an old dry stone wall and ducked into patches of woods now and then. I passed the stone bridge and climbed a gentle hill covered in short grass and moss. I found a spot at the top that looked out over a narrow valley. There was no one else in sight, just a breeze and the distant sound of sheep. I set up my tent just as the sun started to fall behind the trees. It was early June, so there was still light until nearly 9:30. The first night was peaceful, cold, but peaceful. I remember waking up once at around 2 in the morning. The tent fabric flapped a bit in the wind. I heard a strange noise then, like a crunch, just one, like someone stepped on dry grass. Could have been a deer, maybe a sheep. I told myself that and went back to sleep. The next day was slow. I made coffee, walked around the edge of the forest nearby, and tried reading, but my mind kept drifting. I thought about work, about my brother, about how far away I felt from everything. At around 5 in the evening, the air got heavy. The clouds turned silver and flat. I figured I'd make a small fire and get ready for an early night. I had enough food, tinned beans, and a few protein bars. Nothing fancy. It was quiet. Too quiet, actually. I remember thinking that. It didn't feel right. There were no birds, no sheep, not even wind. I stood up, stretched my legs, and walked about 20 feet from the tent to relieve myself. I was looking down the slope of the hill into the trees when I saw something, or rather, someone. There was a man, standing at the edge of the forest. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing up toward me. He was maybe 200 feet away, not far enough to mistake what I was seeing. He was wearing a dark coat, black or navy, I couldn't tell in the low light. His posture was strange, still, like too still. He didn't wave. He didn't shift his weight. He just stood there. I froze. I stared back, trying to work out what I was seeing. It didn't feel like someone out for a walk. There were no houses for miles, no public trails. He shouldn't have been there. And more than that, he made no move to show that he was normal. No call, no gesture, just blank, rigid watching. I slowly walked back to my tent, never turning my back on him. Once inside, I zipped it shut and sat still for a long time. I don't know what I expected. Maybe for him to come closer. Maybe for him to shout. Nothing happened. By the time the sun had fully gone, I peeked outside. The spot where he stood was empty now. The woods were dark. Still no wind. I felt like I should leave, but it was late, and the path back was narrow and rough. I told myself it might have been some local or someone lost, but I knew deep down that wasn't right. He wasn't lost. He was standing in a place where someone lost wouldn't stop. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight in my hand the entire time. I must have sat up for hours, ears straining for the smallest sound. Every time a twig snapped outside, I jolted. I kept looking at the thin nylon of the tent and wondering if I'd see a silhouette. But the night passed, and when the sun rose, nothing had happened. I stepped outside slowly. The ground was damp with dew. I scanned the woods. No sign of anyone. No prints, no broken branches. I thought about packing up. I really did. But something made me stay. Maybe pride. Maybe stupidity. I told myself I'd leave if I saw anything else strange. I spent most of that day trying to relax. I hiked a bit deeper into the forest during the afternoon, just to keep my mind busy. I followed an old stone wall that ran down toward a stream. There were signs of wildlife, badger droppings, a few fox prints. I found a rusted barbed wire gate leaning into a tree, and for a second, I felt like I was in a different century. That's how untouched everything felt. But then, around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, I found something that made my stomach turn. It was a fire pit. Recent. The ashes were still black. There were burnt sticks arranged in a triangle, not a circle like most people do. Around the pit were small objects. Bits of cloth. A knife blade with no handle. A sock, muddy and stiff. It wasn't mine. And it hadn't been there long. That was it. I turned back. I started walking fast, not quite running but close. I made it back to my tent in less than 20 minutes. I kept scanning the woods behind me the whole time. Back at camp, I started packing. Fast. I didn't care about order. I shoved everything into my bag. It was maybe 6:30, and I figured if I moved quickly, I could make it back to the farmer's house before dark. But as I zipped the last pouch on my pack, I heard something again. That same crunching. Dry grass just once. Behind me, I turned fast. There, across the field where I'd first seen him, stood the same man. He was closer now, maybe 100 feet. Same posture, same coat, same blank stillness. He didn't say anything. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't move. I stared for a long time. My body felt like it had turned to stone. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I felt like an animal that had been spotted by a predator. Not attacked, just seen. Eventually, I managed to move. I slung the pack on my shoulders and started walking, brisk, not running, but close to it. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following me. The walk back felt twice as long. The trees closed in. The sky turned darker than it should have at that hour. Every snapping twig sounded like a footstep. Every rustle in the brush made me flinch. When I reached the stone bridge, I finally looked back. Nothing. No one. Just the empty trail. I didn't stop at the farmer's house. I didn't want to explain. I went straight to my car and drove. I didn't even turn the music on. I just kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting headlights. But none came. That night, I slept at a travelodge just off the motorway. I locked the door and pushed a chair against the handle. I didn't sleep much. My mind kept going over the details. The coat, the way he stood, the fire pit with those small, strange objects. I didn't call the police. What would I even say? A man looked at me, but it wasn't just that. It was the way he watched, like he had been waiting for something. I've never gone back to that place. I haven't been camping since, not alone. Sometimes I still dream about the woods, about that coat, about that blank, still face in the trees. And what really keeps me up sometimes, even now, is wondering if he followed me for longer than I realized. If he'd been there the first night, or even the first day, just watching without me knowing. And I keep thinking, if I hadn't turned around when I did, if I hadn't heard that one crunch behind me, would I have even made it out? It was 2013, late October, when I went on that trip alone. I had just turned 33. I remember because my birthday was quiet that year, just me and a cake my sister dropped off at the house. I had been working too much. My head was always full of numbers and emails, and I was burning out fast. I needed air. Not a vacation, not a city, just space. I picked Ridge Hollow, a valley tucked into the hills in northern Arkansas. It wasn't anything special. Not a national park or a popular trail, just a long stretch of state forest no one really cared to talk about. That was what I wanted. I needed to get away from people, from work, from everything that buzzed and beeped. I packed light but careful, small tent, my old .22 rifle, some canned food, a few dry meals, and a flask of bourbon to take the edge off the cold. The forecast had called for rain, but I didn't care. I didn't want sun. I didn't want cheerful birds or warm breezes. I wanted to sit alone in a dark, wet forest and let my thoughts settle. I left my car at a pull-off that looked like no one had used it in years. The road was cracked, weeds in the middle. It was already muddy. I walked in about 3 miles downhill into the thick of the woods. The trees were losing their leaves, but enough remained to block most of the sky. I followed no marked trail, just deer paths and game tracks until I found a flat spot surrounded by pine and hickory. I set up camp right there. The air smelled wet and heavy. I liked it. By the time I got the tent up, the light was already fading. The clouds had rolled in thick and low, and the woods went dim quicker than usual. I got a small fire going with some deadfall I found, dried with a bit of fuel from my bottle. I ate beans from a can and a strip of dried meat, washing it down with a swig of bourbon. Then I sat, just sat, listening. The forest didn't make much noise that night.
No birds.
No wind, just the drip of water through the trees and the pop of my fire. It was peaceful in a way that didn't feel peaceful. The kind of silence that feels like something is holding its breath. It started raining just after I crawled into the tent. A soft drizzle at first, then a steady drumbeat. I laid there for a while on my back, listening to the drops on the nylon above me. I thought about work, about how no one even knew I was out here. No phone.
No GPS.
No signal. I didn't even leave a note. It was dumb in hindsight, but at the time I didn't want anyone to know. I wanted to vanish for a while. I fell asleep to the rain. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. No noise woke me, not at first. Just a feeling. A wrongness. I was cold, wet along my side where I'd rolled against the wall of the tent. I sat up, annoyed, and checked for leaks. There were none. but I still felt wet. Not soaked, just damp, like something in the air was thicker than it should have been. I unzipped the flap and looked outside. It was dark. Not the kind of dark you get in the city or even near a road. It was pitch black. I turned on my headlamp and scanned the trees. Rain still fell, soft but steady. Everything glistened. Nothing moved. Then I saw it. Not directly, just the feeling of it. A shape in the dark that didn't match the trees. My light didn't hit it square, but I knew something was there. Tall, thin, not animal, too still. I blinked and leaned forward, wiping water from my eyes. The shape didn't move, but it was there, maybe 20 feet from the edge of my camp, just beyond the tree line. I couldn't see a face, no color, no details. Just that something was there that shouldn't have been. I stared for maybe a full minute. My breath caught in my throat, and I remember not wanting to make any sound. I didn't even reach for my rifle right away. I just watched, waiting. Then it moved. It didn't walk or run. It shifted, like someone leaning slowly to one side, then back. A gentle sway, almost like it was checking me out from a distance. I finally reached for my rifle, my fingers numb from the cold. I pulled it into my lap, trying not to breathe too loud. I aimed the beam of my headlamp straight at the spot again. Nothing. Empty trees. No shape. No figure. I blinked hard, trying to focus. I thought maybe the rain had tricked my eyes, but the feeling didn't go away. That weight, that pressure in the air. I sat like that for maybe 10 minutes, soaked through, holding my rifle, staring into the dark. Then I heard the crunch. It wasn't close, maybe 30 feet off to the right. A footstep, one, slow and solid, on wet leaves. I swung the light toward it, heart racing. Nothing, just trees. Then another, to the left this time, closer. That was when I stood up. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to run, but I couldn't stay frozen. I stepped out into the rain, the cold hitting me like ice. My boots sank in the wet ground. I turned in circles, flashlight scanning. My tent behind me, rifle in my hands, rain in my eyes. I didn't yell out, didn't say a word, just listened, and then all of it stopped. No more footsteps, no movement, nothing but rain and breathing. I stood for what felt like forever, and finally, I backed into the tent again and zipped it up. I didn't sleep. I laid there in my damp sleeping bag, my rifle on my chest, listening to the rain and the occasional crack of a branch or shift in the wind. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, a bear maybe, but it didn't feel like it.
No grunts, nos nortes, no ouves.
Just footfalls, slow, intentional. Morning didn't come easy. The sky just turned a lighter shade of gray. I got up stiff and tired, packed my things, and didn't bother cooking. I wanted out. I didn't take the same trail I came in on. I wanted to loop around, not pass through the same spot where I'd seen the shape. I climbed uphill through thick brush, soaked to my knees, slipping in mud. My hands were scratched from pushing through branches, but I didn't stop. I felt watched the entire way. I reached the ridgeline just after noon. My plan was to follow it north until it curved back toward the road. It would take longer, but I didn't care. That's when I saw the second camp. It was maybe 50 yards off the ridge, down in a hollow behind a screen of trees.
No tent.
Just a tarp strung between two pines, and under it, a pile of blankets and gear. Old gear, faded, mismatched. I saw empty cans.
A rustapot.
A camp chair, no sign of a fire, and no person. I crouched behind a tree and watched. There was something about it that looked wrong. Not just abandoned, lived in but wrong. Trash scattered, tools laying in odd places. No clear sign someone had tried to leave. It looked like someone had just stepped away and never came back. I didn't go down to check. I didn't want to be seen. I turned and hiked fast the rest of the way. I didn't stop until I saw the glint of my car in the distance through the trees. When I reached it, there was mud on the hood, just streaks. Thin, dirty trails like someone had brushed their hand across it. The rest of the car was clean, just rainwater. But that mud was fresh. I stared at it for a long time before unlocking the door. I drove back to the highway with the windows down, letting the cold wind keep me alert. My heart didn't stop pounding until I hit cell service an hour later. I never reported anything. What would I say? That I saw a shape in the woods? Heard footsteps? Found a strange camp? It wouldn't matter. No one would look. No one would care. I've been camping since, but I've never gone back to Ridge Hollow. I never even looked it up again. That place didn't feel empty. Felt like it was waiting, like someone lived out there, watching. I don't know who they were or why they didn't come closer, but I'll never forget that night, standing in the rain, flashlight shaking, staring into the trees at something that stared back. And I still check the hood of my car every time I come back from a trip, just in case. It was October 2014 when I finally took some time off and went on a solo hunting trip up in northwestern Wyoming, near the Shoshone National Forest. I just turned 39, divorced 2 years earlier, and honestly needed some time to clear my head. I've been meaning to do this for a while. I grew up in Montana and had done a fair share of hunting with my dad when I was younger, but after moving to Colorado for work, the trips became fewer and fewer. That fall, I got a long weekend and decided to head out by myself. I'd heard from a guy at work about a stretch of forest off a dirt road past Du Bois where elk sightings had been common. I wasn't looking for anything too dramatic. I just wanted to be alone for a few days, breathe in the cold mountain air, maybe get lucky and bag something, or just sit by a fire and forget about my job, my rent, and my life for a while. I packed light but careful. My Remington 700, enough ammo, tent, thermal sleeping bag, jet boil for coffee and meals, a small axe, headlamp, flares, topo maps, and GPS. I brought enough food for 4 days but planned on staying 3 at most. I made sure to tell my brother Mark where I was going and left him a general area on a printed map, just in case. It wasn't a spot with cell coverage, but I carried a whistle and flare just for safety. I left my truck parked off a dirt access road, far enough into the woods that no one could see it unless they were looking. From there, I hiked about 5 miles through thick pine and scattered birch, eventually finding a small clearing halfway up a ridgeline with a decent view of the valley below. I set up camp there. It was far enough from any trails and high enough that I could scout without having to move every hour. By nightfall, the air had dropped to the low 30s. Felt perfect, crisp, quiet, and cold in that sharp, honest way that only the forest can be. I made a small fire using dry pine I split earlier, sat there sipping black instant coffee, and watched the shadows stretch across the valley like black ink in water. I turned in around 9:30, crawled into the tent, zipped myself up, and let the forest lull me to sleep. The first night was uneventful. Just distant howls, wind creaking through trees, and the occasional snap of a twig far off. Nothing I hadn't heard before, but something still sat wrong in my gut. Not in a dramatic way, just that subtle, dull pressure you feel when your body knows something before your brain does. I ignored it, wrote it off as nerves from being alone. The next morning, I made oatmeal, packed some jerky, and headed further up the ridge with my rifle slung over my shoulder. There were signs of elk, fresh droppings, scraped bark, prints, but nothing recent. I tracked along a dry creek bed for most of the morning, stopping every so often to glass the slopes, but saw nothing but squirrels and a hawk overhead. I turned back around mid-afternoon. As I made my way back toward camp, maybe half a mile out, I noticed something odd. A boot print, not mine, a size or two smaller and a completely different tread. I crouched to get a better look. It was fresh, maybe a few hours old. The dirt was still moist from the morning frost. I didn't panic, but it got my attention. It wasn't hunting season for most out-of-staters yet. Whoever it was either had special tags or wasn't supposed to be there. I scanned the trees but saw no one. No sound either. I figured it might be another hunter or someone hiking off-trail. Still, the woods weren't exactly popular out that far. Back at camp, everything looked untouched. I circled it once just to be sure. No signs of disturbance. The fire pit was as I'd left it. My food was tied up in a bare bag about 30 feet up a pine, still swinging gently in the breeze. I spent the rest of the evening sharpening my knife and reading a dog-eared paperback by headlamp. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. Not loud, just a very soft rustling, maybe 10, 15 feet away. It wasn't wind. It was deliberate, methodical, like someone placing their feet slowly through dry needles. I laid there frozen, listening. My rifle was beside me, safety off, round-chambered. I stayed like that for what felt like half an hour, but the sound stopped after maybe 3 or 4 minutes. I never saw a light or shadow. Eventually, I must have drifted off again, because next thing I knew, morning light was creeping into the tent. The third day was when things got worse. I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My head was foggy. I started boiling water for coffee and oatmeal, but something in the air felt heavy, oppressive, like the woods were watching me. Not in some fairy tale way, just that raw animal feeling of being prey. I ignored it and went scouting again. I didn't go far this time. I stuck within a mile of camp, looping slowly, quietly, careful to leave markers so I wouldn't lose track of my bearings. About an hour into the loop, I found another boot print. Same tread as before, this time deeper, as if they were carrying weight. Close to it was something else. A spot on the bark of a tree that had been scraped. Not from antlers, but with a blade. Fresh, jagged, sloppy. Not carved, just gouged once or twice like someone testing a knife. I felt that pressure in my gut again. Hard this time. I turned back to camp right away, moving faster but quiet, rifle in hand. The whole way back, I kept stopping to listen. The forest was silent. Too silent.
No birds. No squirrels.
No wind. Back at camp, everything looked untouched again. But this time I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the stakes on my tent was loose. Not ripped out or snapped. Just eased out slightly, like someone had been gentle with it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with the rifle across my lap until it burned down to coals. Every time I thought I heard something, I'd turn off the headlamp and wait. At one point, I saw movement up the slope. A silhouette, human, for just a second. It stood still just past the edge of the light, then gone. I didn't go after it. I didn't yell. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. Just sat there, trying to calm my heart. When the morning came, I didn't make coffee. I packed up fast, took down the tent, lowered the bear bag, got everything into the frame pack. I didn't want to run and make noise, so I just moved quick and quiet back down the ridge toward the truck. About a mile from where I'd parked, I heard a branch snap to my left. I turned, rifle up. No one. Then another behind me. Again, nothing. I started moving faster. My boots stomped through wet leaves and soft mud. But I didn't care about noise anymore. I just wanted to get the hell out. The forest around me started to feel tighter, like it was closing in. Every tree trunk looked like it could be hiding someone. When I got to the truck, the first thing I noticed was the driver's side door handle. Wet, mud streaked across it. Same on the rear bumper, like someone with muddy hands had gripped it. I unlocked it, tossed my gear inside, slammed the door, and started the engine. I didn't even take off my pack. I drove 10 miles before pulling over and throwing up into the ditch. Back in town, I found a gas station, cleaned up, got a bottle of water, and sat there in the parking lot for a long time with the doors locked. I didn't call the cops. I didn't report anything. I didn't have a name, face, or any real crime to give them. Just a bad feeling and some muddy fingerprints. I never went back to that spot. Hell, I didn't camp alone again for years. Sometimes I think maybe it was just another hunter messing around, or some survivalist living off-grid. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night and think about those prints, those footsteps, the scratches on the tree, I'm not so sure. What I do know is this: trust your gut in the woods. It knows what your eyes haven't seen yet. And never, ever ignore the silence. Because sometimes, silence means something's waiting. It was early October of 2011 when I took that solo camping trip to northern Arizona. I was 31, single, and tired of sitting behind a desk all week, eating frozen dinners, and watching the same TV shows on loop every evening. I worked in logistics at a warehouse company in Phoenix. Life had become mechanical, and I'd started to feel like a ghost of myself. The idea of sleeping under the stars and getting away from my phone and computer screens was what I thought I needed. I'd camped alone before, mostly in places close to Flagstaff or near the Mogollon Rim. This time, I wanted to go further north, closer to the Navajo reservation land. I didn't plan to enter any protected tribal area. I wasn't stupid, but I'd read online about some little-used spots in the Coconino National Forest, past a small town called Cameron. Sparse trees, rocky cliffs, endless mesas. It looked quiet and empty, exactly what I was craving. I loaded up my old 2002 Toyota Tacoma with all my gear: tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, a small cooler with sandwich supplies, a few cans of chili, my camp chair, flashlight, extra batteries, water containers, and a full tank of gas. I'd brought along a basic first aid kit and a handheld GPS, which I'd borrowed from a friend a week earlier. I wasn't exactly Bear Grylls, but I knew how to set up a tent and read a map. I also made sure to let someone know where I was going, my older brother back in Tucson. I gave him the general coordinates and told him I'd be back in 4 days. I set off on a Wednesday morning. It was cool for Arizona standards, maybe 60 degrees that day, and a little overcast. I made good time on the drive up, cruising past miles of red rock and dusty terrain. I reached the dirt road that led off the main highway around 2 p.m. and started the bumpy trek into the wild. The forest out there wasn't dense, more like scattered trees and brush, with wide open spaces between. The elevation was higher, so the air felt dry and crisp. I finally stopped at a spot that looked perfect. A flat area next to a group of boulders, with a thin line of trees bordering one side and a drop-off overlooking a canyon about 30 yards away. There were no other tire tracks or signs that anyone had been there recently. I got out, stretched my legs, and listened. Nothing, just wind. I couldn't even hear birds. I pitched the tent, unpacked, set up the little propane stove, and sat in the folding chair to eat a sandwich. The sun was dipping lower by then, but I still had about 2 hours of daylight. I walked the edge of the drop-off and looked across the canyon, taking it all in. The vastness made me feel small in a good way. Everything was still. No cars, no people, no noise. Just land and sky. That first night, I fell asleep easily. I didn't even need the flashlight because the moon was nearly full and threw enough light inside the tent that I could see my bag and boots clearly. I left the tent flap open to let in fresh air. I woke once around 2 a.m., needing to pee. I stepped outside, half asleep, and did my business behind the tent. When I looked around, I noticed how completely still it was. The kind of quiet that presses in on you. Even the wind had stopped. But I didn't feel scared. Not then. Just alone. The next day was slow. I went on a short hike near the ridge, followed a dry creek bed for a while, and explored a rocky outcrop about a mile from camp. I didn't see a single animal. No lizards, no birds, not even insects. That stuck out to me, but I chalked it up to elevation and time of year. By mid-afternoon, clouds rolled in and blocked out the sun. I made a small fire before it got dark and cooked some chili on the stove. The wind picked up again that night. I had to close the tent flap because dust was blowing in. Around 11 p.m., as I was dozing off, I heard something crunching through the brush. My ears perked up, but I didn't move. I figured it was probably a deer. I stayed quiet and listened. The sound was soft, spaced out, but deliberate. Not like a rabbit or some small animal. Heavy enough that I could feel the faint thud in the ground under my back. It circled the tent slowly. I held my breath and kept still. My heart started to pound a little, but I still wasn't panicking. I had a knife and a hatchet next to me inside the tent. No firearm, but I told myself if it was an animal, it would eventually get bored and leave. It did after a minute or two. The sounds faded away. I got maybe 2 hours of sleep that night. The next morning, I checked around the tent. The ground was hard and dry, so there weren't any clear footprints. But a few rocks near the edge of the tree line looked like they'd been disturbed. Couldn't be sure. I spent the day closer to camp. I didn't hike out like I had the day before. Something felt different now. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt watchful. That evening, just before sundown, I saw something on the ridge across the canyon. I had taken out my small pair of binoculars to look for deer or coyotes. I scanned the trees and rocks and then stopped. A figure was standing at the edge of the canyon, facing my direction. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out the face, but I could see the shape clearly. It wasn't wearing any bright colors, just looked like dull, faded clothes, torn or old, and the way it stood, it didn't shift its weight or move. It was rigid, unnatural. I stared for several minutes. It didn't move. Finally, I lowered the binoculars. When I looked again, it was gone. I didn't eat that night. I just sat in the tent with the flashlight on and both the hatchet and knife across my lap. The wind had died again, and the quiet returned, heavier than before. I didn't hear any footsteps, but I couldn't sleep. I laid there until dawn, twitching at every sound. Leaves crunching, small rocks falling. Day 3 was when things got worse. I was considering packing up and heading back early, but I felt stupid, like I was letting my imagination get the better of me. So I stayed, but I didn't go far from camp. Around noon, I heard a strange clicking sound from the direction of the tree line. It wasn't an animal noise, more like someone snapping their tongue or tapping 2 stones together. I walked a few yards toward it, but it stopped as soon as I moved. I waited. Nothing. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. I was no longer enjoying any part of the trip. I felt watched every second. That night, as I lay in the tent trying to rest, I heard the crunching again. This time, it didn't circle. It approached slowly from behind the boulders. I sat up, heart thudding, and turned off the flashlight. I didn't want to be seen. I stayed completely still, trying to slow my breathing. The steps were slow, spaced out, not rushing, not hiding either, just deliberate. Then I heard something exhale, long and low, like someone blowing through their nose right outside the tent. I didn't move, couldn't. I felt frozen. I waited in the dark for what felt like an hour. Then the breathing stopped and the steps moved away. But I didn't sleep at all. I watched the fabric of the tent for any movement, straining my ears so hard they started ringing. The next morning, I snapped. I packed everything as fast as I could. The tent poles barely fit in the bag. I left a couple of food wrappers behind. I didn't care. I threw everything in the truck and peeled out onto the dirt road, tires skidding on the loose gravel. My hands were shaking the entire time. I'd driven maybe a mile when I had to stop. A figure stood in the middle of the road. It was the same shape I'd seen on the ridge. I slammed the brakes and skidded to a stop. The truck rocked slightly. The thing didn't move. It didn't flinch. I could see it more clearly now. Its body looked human, but not quite. Too thin, limbs too long. Its clothes looked like they'd been stitched together from old rags. Its skin, from what I could see on the arms, was stretched tight and pale. But what hit me the hardest was the smell. Even from inside the truck, I could smell it, rotting meat and wet fur. I backed up, drove around it. My tires bounced over the edge of the road as I swerved past. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway, and even then, I didn't pull over until I got to a gas station in Flagstaff. I filled up the tank, went into the bathroom, and sat in the stall for a full 30 minutes trying to calm myself. I didn't even realize until then that my shirt was soaked with sweat. I made it home just after sunset. I dumped all my gear in the garage and locked every door in my apartment. I didn't sleep that night either. I kept thinking about the way it moved, the way it stood, the silence around it. A few days later, I tried to talk myself out of it. I read articles about mountain lions, bears, drug addicts wandering the forest, even weird local legends. I didn't believe in monsters, and I still don't. But something out there was wrong. Not fantasy, not a ghost, just wrong. I've never gone camping alone since, and I never will again. I was 35 when I finally made the drive back down to southern Alabama, near the Kanaka National Forest. It was late October 2016. The leaves had just started turning and the air had that crisp bite to it. I remember thinking it was the perfect time to camp. Cool enough for a fire, warm enough to sleep outside without freezing. I had some time off from my job as a warehouse manager up in Tennessee. The last few months had been hell. Long hours, constant pressure, my relationship falling apart quietly in the background. I needed a break from screens, phones, and the same tired routine. So, I loaded up my Tacoma with my tent, gear, cooler, and headed south. There was a spot near a creek I hadn't visited since I was a teenager. My uncle had brought me and my cousin there once when we were about 15. Back then, it had felt like the middle of nowhere, and it still did when I pulled off the narrow forest road 2 decades later. The trail down to the campsite was more overgrown than I remembered. I had to walk in the last half mile, weaving between pine trunks and ducking under hanging branches. The ground was soft with pine needles, the air still and quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was that kind of deep silence where you hear your own breathing too well. When I finally reached the clearing beside the creek, it was just how I remembered it. Flat, shaded, a good 20 yards from the water's edge. The forest bent inward on all sides like it was sheltering the spot. I pitched my tent in the same place we had years ago, facing the creek. The sound of water moving over rocks was faint but steady. Felt right. I built a small fire before sunset, grilled a couple of hot dogs, and had a beer while sitting on a folding chair, staring into the flames. There was no self-service out there, and I hadn't told anyone the exact location, just that I was going camping down south. That thought only crossed my mind briefly at the time, not as a warning but more as a satisfying little fact. No one could bother me. No one would find me unless they really tried. That first night was uneventful. I slept okay, even with the occasional raccoon or opossum rustling around. Morning light filtered through the trees and I got up early to boil water for instant coffee. My boots were damp from the dew, and my hands were stiff in the cold, but I didn't mind. I felt more awake than I had in months. I spent the day walking the surrounding woods. I followed the creek upstream for about an hour, stopping now and then to skip stones, look at tracks in the mud, or just listen. The stillness was almost unnatural at times. I passed a few deer prints, saw some rabbit droppings, nothing out of the ordinary. But about 2 miles up, I came across something I hadn't expected. A small hunting blind, built low into a thick patch of brush. It was old. The camo netting on top had faded and torn, and the plywood underneath had started to rot. There were empty beer cans inside, rusted and caked with dirt. A few shell casings lay scattered in the leaves around it. I didn't think too much about it at first. People hunt out here all the time. It just felt strange to see it so deep in the forest, hidden so well. I turned back after that. Got back to camp just after noon and made some lunch. Spent the rest of the day reading and throwing twigs into the fire pit. But something about the blind stayed in my head. Not just the fact that it was there, but how carefully it had been hidden, like someone hadn't wanted it found easily. That night, after the fire died down, I crawled into the tent and zipped it up tight. I had my small flashlight and my knife beside me, like always, just habit. The creek gurgled softly outside. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine sap, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening, every sound making me lift my head. A snapping branch, a sudden gust of wind, and then around midnight, I heard footsteps. Not the scuttling kind from a raccoon, not the heavy, direct kind of a deer. These were slow, crunching footsteps that started near the creek and moved deliberately across the clearing. I froze, my ears strained against the silence. I couldn't see anything through the tent fabric, and I didn't dare unzip it. The steps got closer, then stopped, and then nothing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, barely breathing, gripping my knife, ears tuned for any more sounds. But it never came back, just the same silence. Sometime before dawn, I must have drifted off. When I stepped out in the morning, the clearing looked exactly the same.
No obvious footprints.
No broken branches, but something felt off. My folding chair was on its side. I was sure I hadn't left it that way. The firewood I'd stacked up was scattered, too. Not in a messy animal way, just like someone had moved it, looked through it. I told myself it had been a raccoon, maybe a bear. That's what I wanted to believe. But something deeper in me said otherwise. I considered packing up, but I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid. I went on another hike, this time sticking to the immediate area. I didn't go near the blind again. I stayed closer to camp, building the fire bigger that evening, leaving it burning longer. I didn't want the dark to creep in too close, but the second night was worse. Started the same, quiet, cold, calm. But around 1 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, this time from the trees behind my tent. Crunch, pause, crunch. It circled. I held my breath, heart pounding. The steps stopped and started again. Then I heard something scrape lightly against the side of the tent. Just once. A dragging sound like a stick or a finger. I stayed motionless for what felt like hours. I didn't open the flap. I didn't call out. I didn't move. Eventually, it left. At sunrise, I got up and walked the perimeter of the campsite. That's when I found the dead squirrel. It had been laid on top of my cooler. His body was whole, but its neck had been snapped. And it was placed there purposefully, like a message. That's when I packed. Fast. I didn't even bother with the fire pit or folding up the tent. I threw everything into the bed of the truck and got the hell out of there. But I didn't drive straight back. I stopped by the local ranger station on the edge of the forest, near Andalusia. I didn't expect them to believe me, and I didn't tell them everything. I just asked if anyone else had reported strange activity near the creek off County Road 11. The ranger on duty looked at me for a moment, then shrugged. That land's not part of the park. It's private beyond that trail. Belongs to some old family. Don't think they live out there anymore, though. That was all he said. I didn't ask more. I just nodded and left. But I looked it up later, when I got back home. That patch of land had once belonged to a man named Curtis Delro. He'd been arrested in the early 90s for some kind of survivalist militia activity, stockpiling weapons, running illegal hunts on his land, and rumored connections to more violent things. Nothing was ever proven beyond the weapons charges, and he died in 2004. But apparently, his sons had stayed off-grid in that area for years. No power, no running water, no contact with outsiders. I haven't been back since. I still have dreams about that second night, about someone circling the tent, about that dead squirrel on the cooler. I keep thinking how easy it would have been for someone to do more than just leave a message. I keep thinking about how lucky I was that they didn't. That place isn't part of any park. It doesn't have cameras or patrols or even signs. It's just woods and water and silence. And maybe something or someone still watching from it. It was the summer of 2011, and I was 26 at the time. I had taken a week off from work just to get away from everything. I didn't want any noise, no screens, no traffic, nothing. I was living in Southampton back then, working as a mechanic, and I just needed some peace. I picked a quiet area in the Lake District. I had read online about a lesser-known trail that looped near Loather Forest, not far from Penrith. People mentioned how quiet and untouched it was, so that's where I went. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, gas stove, a small axe, and the usual gear. I had been camping alone a few times before, so I wasn't nervous. It rained the day before I left, so everything was a bit damp and smelled of wet grass and pine. I parked my car just off a dirt road near an old farm that looked abandoned and hiked about 2 miles into the forest. There was no marked path, just small signs of use. A faint trail, trampled leaves, broken twigs. The forest got denser as I moved in, and the trees grew tighter together. After about an hour of walking, I found a small clearing. It was just wide enough for a tent and had a flat patch of dry leaves. There was no sound except for wind in the branches above. Felt right. I set up my tent, made a small fire pit with stones I gathered nearby, and boiled water for noodles. After eating, I sat on a rock and watched the trees sway. The sun went down behind the canopy, and shadows started crawling in. It got cold quickly, and the silence got deeper. No birds, no bugs, just wind and my breathing. I zipped up the tent and fell asleep to the distant creaking of branches. The first night went by fine. I woke up a couple of times, mostly because of the cold. My sleeping bag wasn't as warm as I remembered, but nothing felt wrong. I spent most of the next day walking. I didn't follow any path, just made wide circles from my campsite. There were lots of broken trees in the area. Some looked snapped halfway up, as if something large had fallen on them. I assumed it was from storms. I came across some deep scratches on a tree trunk. 4 of them straight down about 7 feet from the ground. I stared at them for a while. They didn't look like tool marks or animal claw marks. Maybe someone had done it with a knife, but they were too deep and too high. It bugged me, but I didn't dwell on it. People leave strange marks in the woods all the time. That second night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking I heard something outside the tent. It was faint, like slow steps on leaves. I stayed still for a while, listening, and it stopped. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a fox. I didn't leave the tent until morning. The next day, I didn't wander far. I stayed near the camp and gathered more wood. Around noon, I noticed something odd. My small axe was missing. I always left it next to the fire pit, wedged between 2 stones. Now it was gone. I searched everywhere, even checked inside the tent, but it wasn't there. The grass around the camp looked flattened in a few spots that I didn't remember. I tried to tell myself I must have misplaced it or maybe dropped it somewhere the day before, but I knew I hadn't. That night, I kept a small fire going and stayed up later. The forest felt different. I didn't feel alone. I didn't see anything, but it felt like I was being watched. Around 2 in the morning, I heard that same slow stepping sound again. Not an animal. Too slow. Too deliberate. It was coming from the trees to my right. I held my breath and stared out of the tent's mesh window. I couldn't see anything. Then I heard a faint crunch behind the tent. I stayed frozen. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. As soon as it got light, I packed my bag and moved. I didn't want to walk back to the car just yet. I still had 3 days left of my trip and didn't want to waste it. So I walked north for a couple of hours and found another clearing. Smaller than the first, but it felt safer, more open. That day was quiet. I kept checking over my shoulder and listening for any strange sounds, but nothing came. I still couldn't find my axe, though. That part kept circling in my head. I tried to sleep early that night, but couldn't. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was heavier. Whatever it was moving faster and more confidently. It circled my tent twice. I held my knife tight and didn't move. Then I heard breathing, right outside the tent wall. Slow, deep breaths. I wanted to yell or jump out, but I was frozen. I stared at the tent fabric, waiting to see a shape or a hand press against it, but nothing touched it. After maybe a minute, it moved off. The next morning, I was done. I didn't care if it cut my trip short. I packed everything and started walking south, toward the car. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. I just kept walking. About an hour from the road, I noticed something strange in the dirt. Footprints. Not boot prints like mine. Bare feet. Large. Wide toes. They weren't fresh, maybe a day or two old, but they followed the same trail I was on. I stopped and scanned the trees around me. Nothing moved, but the feeling came back. That crawling sensation on the back of my neck. When I reached my car, I unlocked it and threw everything in the back seat. I didn't check anything. I just drove. I didn't stop until I hit the motorway. A week later, I talked to a friend who used to work in the forestry service. I didn't tell him everything, just mentioned I had been camping in Loather Forest and asked if it was normal to feel like someone was out there. He paused and said that area had been the subject of complaints in the past. People saying they heard strange noises or saw someone watching them. But no one had ever reported anything serious. I still think about that missing axe, and the footprints, and the breathing. There are people out there who live off-grid, who stay deep in forests and never want to be found. I think I crossed into someone's territory, someone who didn't like it. I haven't been camping alone since.